So here we are. I was just looking for another story for fun, and I came across this one. So it was April 1731. So the same time frame as the last one, which is kind of funny. The British ship called the Rebecca is sitting becalmed off the coast of Havana, going nowhere, completely still on the water. And then a Spanish Coast Guard sloop pulls up alongside it. The Spanish captain, a man named Juan de Lon Fendino, boards the ship and accuses the British captain, Robert Jenkins, of smuggling. What happens next is, depending on who you ask, either an act of shocking brutality or a convenient story that changed the course of history. Fernando ties Jenkins to the mast. His crew searches the ship. Then Fernando takes out his cutlass and cuts off Jenkins' left ear. He hands it back to Jenkins and tells him, "Take that to your king and tell him I will do the same to him if he dared." Jenkins sailed home, and then nothing happened for 7 years. And then the British declared war. And then 50,000 people died over a year, maybe, possibly. Well, okay, so here's what we know. Here's the things that don't get talked about enough when people tell this story. Robert Jenkins was smuggling, or at least he was doing what everybody else was doing, which was using illegal trade as cover for a whole lot of illegal trade. And in 1731, that was basically the business model of British Empire in the Caribbean. Here is the background. 1713. After the War of Spanish Succession, Britain got something called the Cinto de Negros. It was a contract that gave Britain the right to deliver 4,800 enslaved Africans per year to Spanish colonies in the Americas. The British government handed this contract to a company called the South Sea Company. Now, here where it gets even messier because, enslaved people just makes it messy, but we go. The South Sea Company was also allowed to send one 500-ton merchant ship per year to trade general goods at Spanish colonial ports. One ship, 500 tons. The company immediately interpreted this as a loophole to run a much larger smuggling operation. They would load a ship with goods, but they would also quietly keep smaller boats ferrying additional cargo back and forth to the main ship while it was sat in port. Technically, it was one ship. Functionally, a lot more than that. Spain knew this was happening. Spain sent Coast Guard vessels, the guardacostas, to board and inspect British ships. The guardacostas were also privately licensed, which meant they were essentially privateers who got to keep a cut of whatever they see. So, inventive. So they had every incentive to find the contraband. And they often found it because there often was contraband. And they also sometimes just took things that were not contraband because they could. Low-level naval chaos in the Caribbean, basically constantly for decades. Jenkins and the Rebecca were part of this world. He was probably smuggling. Fair. The Spanish probably had grounds to stop him. What Candido did not have grounds to do was time to mass torture him and cut off his ear. That part was not okay, regardless of what was in the hold. But that's the historical question. Ear story became the whole reason for a war, and the war was not actually about the ear. So what was it actually about? Okay, so here's kind of the funny part. What happened to the ear? Right? Jenkins made it back to England and he reported the incident. He gave a formal deposition. The British Admiral in the West Indies sent a complaint to the governor of Havana. And nothing happened for 7 years. 7 years. Okay? The public was not outraged. Parliament was not outraged. The king was not outraged. The prevailing mood was basically, yeah, the Caribbean is chaotic, move on. Jenkins kept his ear, though, not unattached to his head. or what was left of it, preserved in a jar for 7 years. He was just walking around with the ear in a jar, waiting for someone to care, because I guess that's what you do. And in 1738, they finally cared, but not because of the ear, because of money. So, by 1738, the relationship between Britain and Spain had deteriorated badly. Who's surprised here? Spain had stopped honoring the Asiento. They suspended the contract, which meant the South Sea Company lost its legal trading access to Spanish colonial ports. The company was furious. Parliamentary opposition politicians who hated Prime Minister Robert Walpole were furious. And merchants who had ships seized by Guardia Costas were furious. Walpole, to his credit, did not want a war. He thought that war would be a bad idea, be bad for trade, be bad for Britain, cost money. He sent negotiators to Madrid, and they actually came back with a deal. Convention of the Pardo, in which Spain agreed to compensate Britain for seized ships. It was a reasonable diplomatic resolution, and Parliament said, no, we don't want that. We want to be mad. Opposition politicians called it a national humiliation. They humiliated us. They wanted a war because they wanted a war. They needed a story that would make the public want to go to war too, because, public backing is very important to warring. So enter Robert Jenkins in his jar with an ear. So March 1738, 7 years after the incident, Jenkins was summoned to testify before Parliament. Okay, the story goes, they pulled the ear out of the jar in the middle of the hearing, held it up, and when asked what he did when the Spaniard cut off his ear, Jenkins reportedly said, I commended my soul to God and my cause to my country. That was a great line. It worked. The public was outraged because, dude, he was just doing his thing. He was doing this for God and country, and he lost his ear. Oh no. War was declared in October of 1739. Walpole reportedly said, watching the celebrations, they are ringing the bells now. They will be wringing their hands soon enough. He was right. The war lasted until 1748, killed somewhere around 50,000 people. For what? So now here's where it really gets interesting. Basically, everything I just told you is either uncertain, contested, or might be completely made up. Start with the ear itself. The account of what Bandino did to Jenkins is not consistent across sources. The most detailed version comes from Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette in October of 1731, which says a Spanish lieutenant named Dorcre, not Bandino, slit the ear down, and then another Spaniard tore it off and handed it back. Other sources say Bandino did it to himself and told Jenkins to take it to the king. These are different stories told by different people about the same event. We do not actually know exactly what happened on that ship. We don't. Then there's the Parliament moment. Historians have gone back to the actual records of the House of Commons from March 1738. Jenkins was ordered to attend, but the records for the actual session where the testimony supposedly happened do not mention him at all. One very thorough 19th century historian concluded that Jenkins probably never appeared before Parliament with the ear. The whole dramatic scene might not have happened. And then there is the pub brawl theory. Some historians have raised the possibility that Jenkins lost his ear in a pub fight, not at the hands of the Spanish, and constructed or embellished the story later when it became politically useful. There is no hard evidence for this, and there is also no great evidence against it. So it could have happened, or it could not have happened. We do know this because in 1889, historian named John Knox Laughton, what a great name, dug up the original Admiralty letter from Jamaica in 1731, is that a British Rear Admiral did write to the governor of Havana complaining that the Guarda Costa, captain named Fendino, had used a captain in a most barbarous, inhumane manner and cut off one of his ears. So something happened. Something, we don't know exactly who, to, or what exactly, whether Jenkins was actually even involved in this because he wasn't named, but something happened. And 7 years later was accurate. There was a war. It's generally unclear. Also, because historians can't help ourselves because we are, nosy little gossipers. Someone published a peer-reviewed medical journal article in 2013 specifically about the surgical techniques available for ear reattachment in the 1730s and whether Jenkins could have had the ear sewn back on. And the answer is, wait, this is actually a medical journal. Okay, I will put the source here. Kind of, but probably not well. The journal is Otology and Neurotology? Whatever. This is a real citation I'm going to put in with my notes, with the other sources. Okay, this is real. Someone did it. One more thing. The war was not called the War of Jenkins' Ear at the time. Nobody called it that until 1739. Or nobody called it that in 1739. The British called it the War with Spain. The Spanish called it the Guerra de Jacinto, the War of the Jacinto Contract, which is actually the most honest name because it tells you what the war was really about. This is not the first time in history that the Spanish have been kind of right in their propaganda. Another instance would be the Spanish flu that wasn't Spanish. We just blame them. The War of Jenkins' Ear was invented in 1858 by a British historian named Thomas Carlyle. Over a century after the war ended, he used it as a slightly sarcastic shorthand for a complex conflict he thought was badly motivated and badly run. It stuck. Now we call it that. The historian's joke became our official name of war. The thing that keeps jumping out at me about this story is how the ear became a story about an ear. The actual causes of the war were trade disputes, colonial competition, a company losing its contract, and politicians who wanted power. All of that is complicated and hard to be outraged about. But a man with his ear in a jar is easy to be outraged about. The gap between the thing that actually caused something and the story that gets told about what happens is one of the most consistent features in history. Another example would be the War of the Bucket. We only know it as the War of the Bucket, but it wasn't really about the bucket. The bucket actually did not even come into play until the end of the war. And maybe I'll go through that story one day. And right now, when you see something become the symbol of a much bigger conflict, it is worth asking, what is actually in the jar? Why are we actually doing whatever we're doing? So this is the episode of The Fire for today. I am Professor Angie Boma, and this is the Snarkives. The sources are now going to be in the show notes, including the ear surgery article, which you are welcome to look at. Have a wonderful day.